Hey, what is up everybody, Platform Disciple here, and we're going to do a little discussion video today, but before we get into the topic, let's start by talking a little bit about me giving away booster packs every video. So the winner from last video is Palm, but a couple things I need to say. One is Palm, your username was spelled wrong. The M and the L in Palm needed to be capitalized, which was not a big issue because your username's fairly short, so I was able to figure out why it wasn't going through at first. But for those of you in these contests, I need to make sure that you guys have everything right about your username down to capitalization. It's very important because if I can't figure out why I can't send you the booster pack, I will have to give up and give the booster pack to someone else. And that sucks because that means you'll never actually win due to a simple mistake. The other thing I was going to say is that Palm, although Palm is the winner, Palm was actually only one of 2 entries from last week's video, which leads me to believe that people don't know that I'm giving away a booster pack every video. Because last week's video had like 16 likes on it and a fairly large number of comments. So it seems like, I mean, obviously people are watching it, but maybe you're not realizing that you have the opportunity to get free booster packs. And I'm giving away alternate art booster packs too, so everyone should be trying to get in on the action. So to change this, instead of commenting your username in the comment section, I'm going to try to make this easier by every video is going to have a link in the description to this Gleam website where it's going to ask you your username and it's going to ask you to be subscribed to the YouTube channel. And if you've done this, you will be entered into the contest to win the booster. And you're going to have a week to enter. So those of you who see the video a little late, it's fine. Anyways, I think I've explained that well enough. Let's move on to the actual discussion in the video. And I have a little cheat sheet over here, just so I don't get too off topic. And what we're going to be talking about is meta health and like game health. And this is something I'm bringing up in part for 2 reasons. The first is I think the meta health in Infinity Wars is really, really good right now. And the second is that for those of you who are fanatics about other card games, particularly Magic, The Gathering, and Hearthstone, you'll know that the standard formats in those games, a lot of people have been complaining about for a few months because they are not healthy. They are not a good game meta health. So let's talk about what bad game meta health looks like and what good game meta health looks like. So the first thing that you need to care about in terms of the meta health is deck diversity / faction representation in terms of like the top decks. So in these other games, one of the major problems is that there's only a few top decks and sometimes certain factions are not represented enough. Like in Magic, there's like 2 very clearly dominant decks right now for standard. And in Hearthstone, you have the problem of there's a couple factions or classes like Hunter and Paladin that are super, super underrepresented. And there's like stats that you can look up to show this. Like there are just less people playing those classes because people have come to the conclusion through experimenting that those classes are just not strong enough to justify playing. And that's something that's not good for the game. The next key part of meta health is counterplay. And that's important on 2 levels. One is you want players to feel like at any stage of the game, well, maybe not any stage of the game, but at least for the first few turns of the games, they feel like the outcome isn't already decided. And in addition to that, you want there to be a different kind of counterplay, which is the rock, paper, scissors counterplay. So one is counterplay in-game. You don't want the outcomes to be predetermined. And the second is the rock, paper, scissors game. If in a game, like if you consider each kind of strategy like a different part of rock, paper, scissors, like if you considered aggressive decks rock, control decks paper, and then like mid-range decks scissors or something like that, that's just me making this up, then if there are really, really strong aggro decks, that means that hopefully the control decks are suddenly going to take over those aggro decks, and it's going to rotate around nicely because one type of deck counters another type of deck naturally. In bad meta health, you run into the problem where rock is so strong that paper isn't doing its job in terms of countering it. That's just the way to look at this. That's a problem. And then the last thing you need to consider in terms of meta health is the distance between the tiers of decks. And you know that when I do deck techs, I frequently say this deck is tier 1, or this deck's like tier 2, or this deck's just goofy and isn't really competitive at all. If the game health, like the meta health, is bad, that means that the distance between tier 1 and tier 2 is so far that a tier 2 deck almost never beats a tier 1 deck. And that's a problem, because it means that ultimately you're going to see the same deck over and over and over, or the same decks over and over and over, because no one has any reason to move outside the comfort zone of the tier 1. But in a good meta, in a meta that's very healthy, the tier 2 decks are only slightly worse than the tier 1 decks, so you'll run into the situation where tier 2 decks still outperform tier 1 decks if the player using the tier 2 deck is very good, or maybe they just need a little luck, honestly. Because although Infinity Wars, I think, is more strategy than any other card game I have played, like the ratio of strategy to luck, but there is still luck involved in this game and in any card game, because sometimes you draw the right card, sometimes you don't. But point is that the distance between tiers also matters. And now let's take a look at how Infinity Wars is right now. And I think it's hit all these three things that I've brought up perfectly, or nearly perfectly. And let's just look into it. So deck diversity and faction representation. Right now, there are top decks for almost every faction, and even within those factions, there are still multiple top decks. Like Warpath, we've got the Martyr of Life decks. Genesis, we have multiple very powerful decks like Logarithmatron decks, and just like Robots aggro decks. Veror, we have all these strong control decks, and we also see combinations of Veror with Flame Dawn for like Death Blast decks are still strong. Flame Dawn has just always been strong, and there's this Flame Dawn Genesis deck that's running around that's really good. DoD, Descendants of the Dragons, has got Shunhel's Urn, and it's just like built its own entire new kind of like sub-strategy within the control game for them. Exiles still works very well with Descendants of the Dragons, and like Overseers in particular is merit-worthy, because Overseers was this really, really, really underrepresented weak faction before Rebellion, but when Rebellion came out, the cards like Raziel and Declarius just completely changed the strength of that faction in a very good way. So how did the meta get so good? Is the short answer is that Rebellion completely changed the game. And let's rewind for a sec, and just for those of you who were around before Rebellion or subscribed to this channel before Rebellion, you'll remember that the meta was actually very different then. I would complain all the time about this Tinker combo deck. because it was good at like every stage of the game. It was super consistent, and you'd see it all the time on Ranked Ladder. And then when Death Blast came out in Wave 1 or whatever it was, I think it was Wave 1 of Rebellion, this Death Blast deck got super insanely strong, and you saw it all the time. So you saw these two decks all the time. They were both Varroa. They both were so strong at every stage of the game and were very hard to counter, even though you knew you were going to be playing against those decks. There wasn't much you could do in terms of preparing yourself. Like, whereas right now, although the Death Blast deck still exists and the Tinker combo deck still exists, there are decks that are of similar power levels, and also there are tools now that can be used to kind of take advantage of these decks, because you know they're coming and you know what you need to do against them. But also just the having more top decks is another really like big aspect that's just changed the game. And this is kind of shocking to me, because prior to Rebellion's release, I actually made a video saying that the Death Blast deck and the Tinker combo deck, because they were so consistent and so strong, I was concerned that even after all the Rebellion cards would be released, that these decks would stay the strongest decks, because they were just so good before. And what really happened is that when Rebellion came out, what I was afraid was going to happen was that the already good decks were going to get stronger, and even if other like less powerful decks got stronger, they wouldn't get strong enough to compete with things like Death Blast and Tinker combo. But in reality, what really happened was Death Blast and Tinker combo only got a tiny bit stronger, whereas these other decks got way stronger. Things came out that were completely changed which decks we were seeing. Like the Triple Warpath Martyr of Life deck was obviously impossible before Martyr of Life, and any Overseer's deck was so weak compared to how they are now with Raziel and Declarius. And putting things like that on the board helps fill in that rock, paper, scissors that I was talking about earlier. Like before Rebellion, there just wasn't enough like paper around, I guess you could say. And it's changed now. And that was a pleasant surprise. So I think we, especially looking at like Hearthstone and Magic right now, we really have to respect the Infinity Wars balance team and the developers for doing what needed to be done to make it a very healthy meta, which was make cards that were strong, like really strong, but not for the decks that were already super powerful. And I know there are some exceptions, like for example, let me think of an example. Well, the good news is I can't come up with an example very quickly, but here's one. Splitter Light. This was a card that all it did was make existing Genesis decks stronger. It didn't actually bring anything new to the table. So this was, although I think the card's very cool and I think a lot of people like Splitter Light, this was ultimately a card that was not something that was good for meta health. Whereas another Genesis card, like for example, no, not Omnitron, Placebotron, Placebotron, this card did not make the existing deck stronger, but it did make the Omnitron deck, which was kind of a troll deck before, into a kind of like an actual contender that people need to think about. So that was an example of a card that was very good for meta health. So point is that the design team and the dev team have just done such a good job. And real quick, I do want to say that I'm not just like BSing right now. I have played a lot of ranked recently. I'm currently 17th, so I have played enough ranked to know that there are that the meta is very healthy right now, and I'm willing to go out and say the extreme, which is that this meta right now is the healthiest meta I have seen in any card game ever, in terms of the deck diversity and the distance between tiers, which speaks great things for this game and the future of this game. But now let's cover the exceptions, and there aren't actually that many exceptions, but let's get into it. One is that there are two factions that are not represented as much in the meta as I would like to see them be. And it will come as no surprise to you that these two factions are Sleepers and Exiles. And no surprise, Sleepers received one card from Rebellion, and it wasn't one that changed the game very much for them. It was a Super Infectious Zombie, which, although it's like a pretty good card, actually very good in Rift Run at least, it doesn't even it hasn't changed Sleepers in Constructed enough for them to see play. They are overwhelmingly weaker than any other faction right now. Although I think Sleepers are very cool and very fun, it's an undeniable fact. They are weaker than any other faction right now. And even when you're just splashing one Sleepers, there are fairly low numbers of decks that actually splash Sleepers, especially since Fear got changed. Putting that to 2 Purity basically took Sleepers out of any kind of 1 Purity splashable deck, because you can no longer put just one Sleeper's Purity in to take advantage of potentially what was one of their most powerful 1 Purity effects, and they just don't have that anymore. I think the best Sleepers decks right now are the Infested Abomination decks, which are not even a Sleepers only card, which is of some concern. And Exiles similarly got very few Rebellion cards, less than any other faction. It didn't get the complete, like, almost zero amount that Exiles did, but it got very few, and that certainly didn't help the faction out. And although we do still see the faction quite a bit, because they have some cards that are just so powerful, notably Tibat. Like, as long as Tibat exists, we will see Exiles. We haven't seen really any like new Exiles decks that have really gotten up into the top tiers. There are some good ones, but they are underrepresented. Not nearly as much as Sleepers are underrepresented, but point is, we don't have a perfect deck diversity. And how would you fix that? Obviously, I think the answer is give those factions the support they deserve. They needed more cards, and they didn't get those cards. They can't keep up with the other factions if they just don't get new cards. And admittedly, at one point in time, like, and this is years ago, so I don't know if this is still going on, they planned on rotating Sleepers out, and then Exiles would be the faction that would follow, I believe, in terms of rotation. So these cards not getting... these factions not getting new cards and being underrepresented would be the correct way to slowly transition them out of the game. But I don't want to see that. If they do that, it's not the end of the world, and I think they're doing it the right way by slowly rotating them out, because like right now, they kind of already have rotated Sleepers out by just not giving them anything worth playing. So yeah. And the other thing, I have two more things to say, which is that the other weakness in Infinity War's meta health is counterplay. And not that there is a lot of counterplay in terms of the rock, paper, scissors counterplay. Like, for example, if I see nothing but aggro, I will switch to Descendants of the Dragons and Exiles and use Tibat, and I will never lose a game. Like, it's this card is the ultimate paper to Flamedon's rock, basically. And that's good that this game has such high level of counterplay in terms of that rock, paper, scissors structure. But what it does have some trouble with is some games are decided super, super early by cards like Raziel. Depending on the deck you're playing, if you do not draw your early removal for Raziel, you lose the entire game. Which is, it's not that big of a deal, because if you lose the game because you couldn't kill Raziel, that is in part of the rock, paper, scissors wheel. Like, you can kill Raziel if you're in triple Flamedon by playing Flamedon Commando very early. And if you don't, you might lose. But not every deck has that weakness. You can play Veror, in which case you will have probably very little trouble ultimately getting rid of Raziel. You will get him eventually, even if you don't get him on turn 1 or turn 2. So I think that's an okay loss for the game in terms of meta health. But the one thing that I am very worried about is right now this card is disabled, but Marina the Selfless, when she was reworked and when she was not disabled, when she was being played, she took this card Raziel from being something that was like oppressive for certain factions to deal with, like Flamedon would struggle to deal with this card, or other factions with very low removal would struggle to deal with this card, to every faction would struggle to deal with it, and there was almost nothing you could do to stop it, because if you didn't kill Raziel on turn 1, Marina is a deploy effect, which means it happens before anything else. So you can't use targeted removal like, for example, Demonize. Couldn't use something like Demonize. And that's a problem. I don't think that the Balance team had in mind Raziel when they changed Marina. And if they did, I think they sorely overlooked how powerful that combo would be. It's so unbelievably strong. And I know that the character is supposed to lose Untouchable when Marina dies, and they have her disabled so they can fix that. But I don't think even if they do lose Untouchable, I think this card's still too good. It's too hard to kill Marina and then kill Raziel, especially since Marina will never leave the support zone. It's just so freaking hard to deal with that, and it feels like there's no counterplay. So although I am saying right now the meta health is the best it's ever been and is better than any other game I've ever played, that could change as soon as they put Marina back in the game. So this is kind of like a warning to the Balance team. And I don't know if any of them are going to see this. And this is also a warning to players that although we've reached like the nirvana of meta health right now, and you can basically jump into ranked and play with any deck you want and get really high up there. And I promise this is true. I've been playing so many different weird decks on ladder and really high up. But as soon as they make Marina a playable card again, we might see nothing but Raziel decks, and I really don't want that. I mean, I guess the other card we might see is Chlor, another very snowbally 1-drop. But I don't want to see either of those decks being the only decks on the ladder, because there's very, very, very few ways to counter that, and that's bad. If Marina gets enabled again, I foresee Raziel Chlor decks being not only the strongest decks, but also almost impossible to counter. So I seriously, seriously, seriously think that the Balance team should return Marina to 3 cost. They can leave the Untouchable effect if they want, but as is, being able to go straight from Chlor or Raziel into Marina the next turn, is too easy to do and too strong. And part of the reason for that is that it's really consistent, because if you're using 3 Marinas, Chlor and Raziel are in your command zone, which means that you have 100% reliability of having those cards on turn 1, and you have a very high chance of having Marina in your hand by turn 2, between mulliganing and you get to draw a card at least. So yeah, that's pretty much all I want to say. And I hope you found the video interesting. It might be a little long. It was quite the rant. But I do really think that I needed to say that, first of all, the meta health is so good right now. And second of all, please make sure that Marina doesn't ruin this, because right now we are in such a good place. And if Marina comes back into the game as is, I think it's going to be the catalyst that is just going to bring a huge disaster into the meta. Okay, thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you later.